This is Barry, and welcome to the Simplicity Zen Podcast. If you're watching this on YouTube, if you could take a moment and hit subscribe and the alert button and like the video, I'd appreciate it. It helps motivate YouTube to distribute this podcast to a wider audience. If you're listening to this, I guess like most people these days, on one of the podcast apps, you can subscribe on the app, or you can go to simplicityzen.com and sign up for the newsletter there. You can also, there's a contact information for me there. I love hearing from people. So if you want to reach out about anything that you've heard on the podcast, I'd love to hear from you. Today, my guest is Deborah Eden Tull. She's the founder of Mindful Living Revolution. She's a Zen meditation and engaged Dharma teacher, public speaker, author, and sustainability educator. She trained for 7.5 years as a Buddhist monk at a silent Zen monastery and has taught engaged Dharma for over 20 years. She's an author of multiple books, with her most recent being Luminous Darkness, an Engaged Buddhist Approach to Embracing the Unknown. Being here today so much. Thanks for being here so much with us here today.
I'm grateful to be here with you, Barry.
Sorry, I was reading something that's saying that, and both my thoughts got mixed up. That's what
it happens.
Could you tell us, before we kind of get into the autobiographical stuff, could you tell us a little bit about what the Mindful Living Revolution is? Is it a practice center or a community, or kind of what's the context of all of it?
Sure. It's a nonprofit that serves a global community of people. We've grown a lot over the years since I've been teaching out in the world, since I left the monastery. And we gather both as a regular Sangha and for retreats and online teachings. And really a theme is engaged Dharma, the intersection between our personal practice and our love and pain for and desire to serve our world. So thanks for asking.
Okay. And do you guys have a kind of an online community? What's the kind of, on a day-to-day basis, what's the kind of the social touch points?
We have an online community. We have a weekly Sangha and a number of, I would say, online community spaces that as people become more experienced and deepen in their practice, they join in. And we're seeding the vision right now of starting an in-person center. I'm settled here in the mountains of North Carolina, and this would be a vision for a center for eco-dharma, a center for practicing presence and partnership with nature. And it's something that's been forming for a long time. So I'm glad we're starting to be in that moving from incubation to creation period.
So when you say eco-dharma, could you define that?
Sure. Well, I'll acknowledge that I first came to meditation practice as a teenager when I just started college, about the age of 18. And my first year of college, one of the books handed to me by a environmental studies teacher was Joanna Macy's World as Lover, World as Self. And this is the book that really opened the gateway for me to eco-dharma. I was always aware that it felt like the natural world was my greatest teacher. And so much of the simplicity and crystal clear clarity of Dharma as I began meditating and studying Dharma, reading Suzuki Roshi's Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, for instance, I felt supported in awakening to this through my relationship with the natural world. I grew up in LA and just always had my eyes open as a young person to the level of overconsumption in that society, aware of the indiscrepancies of wealth and the lack of sustainability. So, you know, by the time I was in college, I was rather, we could say, heartbroken and also riled up, wanting to be of service. So Joanna's book, which merged the teachings of, for instance, dependent co-arising from Buddhism with the study of natural systems and deep ecology, kind of helped to weave together my understanding of the connections between our suffering and the way the myth of separation operates within each of us, within us individually, collectively, and our relationship with the earth. The recognition that for me, it's through my earth connection, through my willingness to wake down into my body and to embody, to acknowledge, to be awake to my part of the living systems of planet Earth, not as separate, that awakening occurs. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Oh,
that's really been a thread in my path the whole journey.
mhm. Yeah, I went through kind of a shamanism phase. You know, um, I kind of had my eyes open a little bit, kind of by the whole Grateful Dead scene, and
Uh-huh.
I kind of was like looking at different traditions to try to understand when the heck just happened, and shamanism was kind of the first thing I kind of gravitated towards, and ended up not really being the thing for me, but I really appreciated the kind of the connection to nature and just
Yes.
so was there ever any kind of I guess my question is, was there ever any kind of explicit interest in shamanistic teachers or shamanistic traditions, or if so, which ones? Kind of.
Yes. And I want to give a shout out to a book that came out this year by Zenju, um,
Right, right, yeah,
about the shamanic bones of Zen. That spoke to me a lot
yeah,
because animism, the recognition of all of consciousness as alive, all of life, the invisible and visible, as who we're living here in partnership with. This has been a thread through my whole life. And I had many experiences as a kid, especially because I had a father who I describe in my new book as my first spiritual teacher. He was a contemplative Christian who was simply wide open himself. He was steeped in his connection with the natural world and really passed that on. But this is always a thread in my younger years. And then I think as I began to get older, I noticed the degree to which in our world there seemed to be a kind of unconscious bias that rational mind is superior and one's earth connection, one's intuition, the realm of imagination, relational forms of knowing are sort of secondary. So I doubted or undervalued that strong connection I had. And for instance, reading Joanna's book and then the path that set me on really opened it wide open again. When I was a monastic, and this is very rare, I think, within a Zen monastery, our teacher invited each of us to work regularly at times throughout the year with a mystic, a shaman himself, a man who channeled a Tibetan teacher named Ramada. And he really, really supported me in a continual journey, I would say, through acknowledging the overlaps of having a solid meditation practice and really opening to communication with all of life at a more mystical level. And that's certainly part of shamanism or animism. Yeah.
cool. So where did you grow up?
I grew up in LA,
In LA, okay. Like in the city of Los Angeles itself, or the
the
county, or
city of Los Angeles itself.
okay. And how was that?
How was that? That's a great question. It was a mixed experience. LA is a really, I think, incredible place in terms of history, culture, creativity, the ocean and desert and mountains coming together.
Hmm.
And at the same time, it's a really busy field. I remember when I um, moved back to LA unexpectedly after living as a monk. I remember being able to feel the collective thought field palpably
Hmm.
because I had become so sensitive. And I had a really unique experience growing up there. And that means, one, I had parents who were nature lovers, they were hippies, they
Hmm.
were artists and activists themselves. So we did spend a lot of time out in nature. But also, when I was 6, my mom, who had been an artist, read an article about the horrifying situation of kids in Skid Row, of marginalized populations, and she took action and she made a change in her life, devoted her entire life from then on to being an advocate for an activist working on systemic homelessness and helping the people first of Skid Row, and then being someone who consults internationally to exit that system and cycle of homelessness. So that was an incredible education to have as a young person. It was incredible to live in a place like LA and be part of a community movement that was about service. And service has certainly been a cornerstone in my life from that modeling. Yeah.
Professionally, were your parents academics or community
No,
workers?
they were social workers and artists. It's interesting because a lot of people, when they're considering taking an action towards a cause like my mom did, they undermine it by, but I don't have the money, I don't have the training, I'm struggling myself. We were poor. My parents were working hard to be able to pay rent, and sometimes we couldn't afford groceries, but my mom let the bigness of her heart guide, and somehow she managed within just a couple week period to gather the support she needed, to raise the funds she needed to start her first center. So it was great modeling. Yeah.
Did they were there like spiritual books around and so forth that kind of influenced your young mind that you
There
picked up?
were, yeah, it was great because my father, as I said, was a contemplative Christian. My mom was Jewish, and they really shared the message that, your spiritual path is going to be the most important thing in your life. So how you get there, what you choose is personal to you, but we're going to introduce you to a number of different influences. So I lost my dad when I was 11, but before that time, he would read to me Krishnamurti from the Tao Te Ching, Richard Bach, Jonathan Livingston Seagull, and from St. Francis and Christianity. Just so many different influences, and that really made a rich impact on me. Yeah.
I'm sorry to hear you lost your dad so young. I imagine that was kind of an existential shock to the
It
system.
was. It was an existential shock when I was 11. He found out one day out of the blue that he had 1 month left to live. And it was especially a shock because he was such a sort of devoted to health person. He practiced yoga and spent a lot of time outdoors. And what had happened is he had a mole that was misdiagnosed and ended up being malignant melanoma. So that month was like being hit by the avalanche of impermanence, by a family's biggest nightmare. And it really did open up the path for my Buddhist practice. And part of it was actually getting to see someone like him who had a practice, a solid practice in his life, bring his life to closure in a graceful and beautiful way, as painful and rugged as it was. So that really informed me. And I knew I wasn't going to be spending time casually in life. I was asking big questions and understood from a young age that our time here is short, even if we live to be 100 years old.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I was going to ask you earlier, a lot of times when kids grow up in kind of, I want to say hippie, but kind of spiritually oriented houses, sometimes they kind of rebel against it a little bit. But I guess with this tragedy, you kind of maybe didn't go through your rebellious phase.
Not in that way. No, maybe I rebelled against the overconsumption of LA that I saw, but I was on the spiritual path, devoted from a young age. Yeah, yeah.
What were you like as a kid and teenager? Were you kind of introspective? Were you outgoing? Were you like kind of a party animal?
That's a great question. I think I've always had an introvert and extrovert. I've always had a contemplative side. I've always been sensitive and empathetic and a really good listener, though the significance of listening and actually listening as the essence of meditation didn't become clear to me till later in life.
Hmm.
Um, I've always loved people and have definitely, as a young person, had a lot of close friendships and different communities I was a part of. I think that's something I identified strongly with. Like, I don't have one identity. I travel between many different communities,
Hmm.
and that felt important to me. But I'll also say that, after my dad passed, as happens to many people, I very much began to kind of quell my grief or just push it down, not really seeing that grief was so welcome in the world. So I definitely developed a survival strategy of appearing to be happy at all costs, even when
Hmm.
I was really sad inside, or hiding certain aspects of myself. And I write about that quite a bit in the new book, because part of it was kind of a response to the feeling of living in a society where we're supposed to keep things light and be sunshining and happy and stay positive and kind of at all costs avoid the stickier but more real and more human stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I was recently, I don't know what, have you heard of Reddit, the social media platform?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was reading on Reddit, like a thread on Reddit the other day, how a lot of times people, they'll suffer either a personal health crisis or a family, someone will pass away in the family. And so many people were reporting how, their friends in their community just abandoned them and stopped coming around. And,
Yes.
I think part of it is people don't know how to don't know how to relate to that or deal with it. And so they kind of just avoid it because they don't know even how to relate to the situation. And I wonder if like your kind of drive to present like maybe you kind of intuitively realize that and your drive to present a happy face was kind of,
Yes.
to avoid that kind of dynamic to some degree.
I think you're spot on. And I'm aware of so many stories about what you're describing, of people having experiences of deep grief and loss, and losing friendships, community kind of just not understanding. I was lucky that I had a strong community and friends that I had my whole childhood, but there was still this kind of quiet, almost like pressure to be getting past grief as quickly as possible.
Hmm.
And I'll just name that later, in my 20s, I got to do quite a lot of traveling and studying intentional communities in different parts of the world and different approaches to sustainable living. And I remember being so touched, for instance, when visiting India, to just see that death was so much more integrated in their life, and even the
Hmm.
presence of the river Ganges, and in a way that felt deeply peaceful and honestly human. And so
Hmm.
I think it's a way that the dominant paradigm here, we're having this conversation in the US, has a lot of evolution to do. And I also think that some of the challenges of our time and the pandemic and what we're all facing with climate change invites people to into a bigger embrace, right? Of
Hmm.
beginnings and endings, approaching death
Right.
and loss differently. Yeah.
Hmm. So did you ever get into psychedelics or anything like that?
Yes, most
You're,
definitely. When I was
uh,
in college, a time of being so open and so seeking alternatives to the conditioned mind, alternatives to the dominant paradigm. Um, yeah, definitely spent time engaging in magic mushrooms and LSD and having really mind opening, heart opening experiences. Let me
mhm.
just take a sip of water.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would say some of those experiences just, for instance, that plant medicine as a path to remembering something that's innate in us,
Hmm.
a connection with the natural world, a oneness. that is who we actually are, certainly inspired me in my Buddhist practice, because it's like, so here's a way we can get there through taking something from the external into us, but how can we just get there through a gentle shift in our consciousness, in our awareness? So definitely a connection with my meditation practice.
Did you ever get involved in the Grateful Dead scene or the rainbow gatherings or anything like that?
In my life, I've been to one Grateful Dead show and one rainbow gathering. And my older brother, he was 8 years older, and my brother's always been a creative inspiration in my life. He was a great Deadhead for many years, so I got to experience it indirectly through him and indirectly through other friends. One thing is, I never really enjoyed pot, and so I found a lot of my friends in that scene wanted to smoke pot, and it was just never my thing. So yeah, but I still appreciate their music to today.
Yeah. Do you remember what Dead show you went to by chance?
Gosh, all I can tell you is that it was back east. Let's see, we were on a spring break trip in college, and it was, I want to say that we were in, of all places, South Carolina.
Okay. Yeah.
Do you remember where the last one you went to was?
Because I was based out of LA and saw a lot of Dead shows there. I thought maybe we'd been to the same one. So
You probably did the same as my brother.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, where'd you go to college?
I went to a place called Hampshire College in Massachusetts. It was a small liberal arts school that allowed you to design your own major. And I had gone to a pretty hardcore high school, and I think really wanted the permission to create. And so designing my own major was super inspiring for me. Yeah.
Did they have any classes on Buddhism or?
They did.
Or anything like that?
They had classes I couldn't have found at any other college. So yeah, there were some great classes on Buddhism, a circle of people who meditated together. That's kind of when I established a daily practice. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you think those Buddhism classes, do you think those were kind of your main introduction to Buddhism, or were you already interested?
I was already interested, just some books that I had read as a teenager. And then, as I mentioned, Joanna Macy's book, my first introduction to Zen through Suzuki Roshi. But it was really just the experience, because as I said, even by the time I got to college, I had been through quite a bit of internal grief and felt a lot of confusion about just what my generation had inherited in terms of state of the world, and wanting to respond consciously. So another influence for me was a book by a Swedish activist named Helena Norberg Hodge called Ancient Futures, Learning from Ladakh. And Helena wrote about, in depth, the lifestyle and the beauty of this traditional Buddhist culture in the Himalayas, and also what they were up against in terms of threat from globalization and Western influence. And I later worked for Helena, an organization working to protect traditional cultures as our world was changing. But I would say that inspired me deeply. And I mentioned getting the privilege of traveling during that time. I was supported by my college to spend a year traveling, and it was just an incredible opportunity. And to go and stay with some villages and some peoples who embodied a very different paradigm than the one I had witnessed. And some of them more Buddhist paradigm or directly Buddhist paradigm, that just witnessing and being in made a whole lot more sense to me than modern world.
What did their day-to-day touchstone with Buddhism? Was it rituals or meditation, or like where did the rubber meet the road with their Buddhist practice, do you think, or their Buddhist?
Yeah. Certainly ritual and meditation. But I think more importantly, a relationship with the land, with the earth, that was one of reverence and respect and partnership rather than just seeking to get what ego can get from this place or this resource. And also a real sense of community, kind of a sense of, I can be joyful really simply. Community and earth connection. There's a deep joy that also carried a humility that was very different from what I was used to seeing, let's say growing up in LA. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. And even I'll share, years later when I lived as a monastic and we ran a retreat center there, I always found it fascinating when people from busy cosmopolitan lives in New York City would come out and have their aha moment where it was like, I'm just spending time in this teeny tiny hermitage with no insulation in the middle of winter time, practicing being for the first time, like not caught in the doing and the drama and the busyness and the glamour. And I'm experiencing peace in a way I never have before. And it was always so rewarding to witness those people's realizations.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So you wound up practicing Zen, which we'll get to, but do you remember your introduction to Zen in particular? Were there early books or teachers or
Yeah.
communities that kind of grabbed your attention early on?
Yeah. The first meditation retreat I attended in college was Vipassana. It was a 10-day silent Vipassana meditation retreat, and it was amazing. And it was really Suzuki Roshi's book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, that just back then and to this day, I can open up to pretty much any page and find great, great wisdom. So that book I recommend to any listener who hasn't read it before. But the first Zen retreat I experienced was with a teacher in that retreat was in North Carolina, and there was something about the simplicity of it and the distilled nature of practice that felt
What
so potent to me.
what
Yeah.
what was that? The Chapel Hills Center?
No, no, it was a teacher named Sherry Huber, whose
Oh,
monastery I later trained at in
she was on.
California.
She broke away from Rochester Zen Center. Is that right? Am I thinking of the same person? Or is that somebody
Sherry was more California based, but it's for listeners. CHERIHUBER. She has a lot of books out that are great, and she happened to be doing a retreat on the East Coast back then.
else?
But soon after that, I had a chance to spend some time, close to 2 years, living and training at Green Gulch Farm Zen Center.
Yeah, I'm
Uh,
very with it, yeah.
yeah, and so I was a farm apprentice there, and it was a really neat immersion in a
What
Zen
era was that?
community. Say it again.
What era was that?
That was probably about 1996 is when I
Okay.
entered there.
Oh.
And
Yeah, so we probably cross paths a little bit occasionally. I used to go there a lot.
oh,
So
great.
maybe
Yeah.
like a student sometimes.
Glad to hear it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then in 2000, I entered the monastery. I felt a deeper calling and was ready to make a more dramatic choice, which,
Well,
yeah.
Um, so I'll get to that in 1 second. Sorry, but so at Green Gulch, do you remember were there any teachers there that you connected with, that you worked with?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I loved about living in community there was um, that there were interaction with so many teachers,
Mm,
but definitely Reb Anderson made a big impact on me then. Uh,
mm,
Fu Schrader, Linda
mm,
Ruth, of course, Norman Fisher,
mm,
and yeah, yeah, many others, because there's so much opportunity there for just a rich conversation over lunch with someone who's been practicing for decades.
So did you go straight from college to residential Zen practice, or did you work for a little while first?
No, my 20s were a dynamic time. So first I moved to the Bay Area, um, started a permaculture collective or sustainability community with a group of friends in the Mission in San
Mhm.
Francisco. I worked both helping to install and organize urban gardens for people of marginalized populations, and I worked for Helena Norberg Hodge, the activist I mentioned,
Mhm.
and continued my meditation practice, all of that. But my 20s were quite dynamic. So I think at some point I was really feeling the call to just live closer to the earth again.
Mhm.
And I went to run a CSA, a community supported agriculture system at Arcosanti, which is a wild intentional community in Arizona that the Italian visionary Paolo Soleri created.
Mhm.
And I don't know if you've ever heard of Arcosanti, but it's kind of about, hey, if we were just starting from scratch with fresh, never before seen vision about how humans could live and design their housing and
Mhm.
lifestyle in the desert, how would it look? And so it's really visionary and interesting. And I was there for a while before, I mentioned earlier that I had a real passion for intentional communities and also
Mhm.
I was just interested, how can we create models for living closer to the earth and in community in much more life affirming ways. So I traveled around and spent time at a number of different communities and had different roles and different jobs in that vein. But often I was a sustainability educator. I was often running the organic garden. I was often teaching people um, ecological design. You may have heard of permaculture design.
Yes, definitely.
So that was what I was up to back then. And at the same time, I was still struggling internally. And I was also witnessing just the extreme level of burnout and drama that people in the world of change agents, people in the world of intentional community were modeling for me. And I was just noticing, so nature does have so many of the solutions we need. Living in partnership with nature and remembering on a practical to mystical level what that means is part of what I'm here for. But the human ego, as far as my observations, and I meant my observations externally and internally, my own ego, seemed to often get in the way. And so I became really interested in deepening practice
Mhm.
in order to see what could be possible for humans beyond the ego. So when I was 26 is when I moved to the monastery, and that was part of my intention, was
Mhm.
to really go deeper in understanding who we can be together, um, freer of ego.
Mhm. What monastery did you wind up at?
It was called the Zen Monastery Peace Center,
Okay.
and it was in the Sierra foothills. My understanding is that last year the monastery sort of dissolved, I think, in part to changing climate there and things. But yeah, it was a beautiful place and really also a center of sustainability. I came there first to practice and to help them start gardens. And because it was really in the wild, it was a great opportunity for kind of my passions to be woven together, practice and how do we live on this land in simple, life affirming, regenerative ways. So it was a solar community.
Mhm.
We lived very simply. We worked on the land and working meditation every day. Yeah.
What was the Zen lineage of that group?
Soto Zen, but a very outside the box, I would say,
Oh.
approach. My teacher at that time seemed to be really passionate about getting to the essence of Zen, stripping down some of the
Hmm.
rituals, though they are so beautiful and so rich, to what does it mean to live simply, devoted to practice,
Hmm.
and also carried a real interest in helping people to acknowledge the, I would say, force of self-hatred, or that which is the ways we've been conditioned to not meet ourselves with compassion. So that was a real focus of hers.
And what was her name?
That was Sherry Huber.
Oh, it was Sherry Huber.
You got it. Yeah. Yeah.
And how did you find that different from Green Gulch? Obviously Green Gulch, by American standards at least, has kind of a lot of rituals and wearing robes and all that kind of stuff. Was,
Yeah.
was there less of that? It sounds like.
They were very different. Green Gulch was, number one, a community, not a monastery. So living in silence in that distilled field is an incredible opportunity. But also, Green Gulch was a beautiful opportunity to live in a traditional Japanese inspired Soto Zen community. Rituals were so much a part of the day and the life.
Uh-huh.
And this was a little different than that. But what I would say and emphasize about it is it was a really hardcore center of training. And I loved that about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It sounds like it was co-ed.
Yes,
Yeah.
co-ed. Mhm. Mhm.
And how is it? So, could you paint a picture of what a typical day was like there?
Sure, there are variations to this because there are times when we were putting on retreats or going on deeper, longer retreats or
Mhm.
sessions, as you know, ourselves.
Mhm.
But generally, we would wake up. At Green Gulch Farm, we were up by 4:30, practicing by 5. This was a little milder in
Yeah.
that we would wake up at 6 a.m. We all lived in different cabins or hermitages sort of dispersed across the property. So I was in a hermitage about 15-minute walk away from anyone else. And we would generally wake up and perhaps in the winter light a fire in my wood stove, do some morning practice, and meet the community for morning meditation at our
Mhm.
shared zendo around 7. And our day would be a Zen schedule of sitting and working meditation. So after breakfast, we'd all um, take care of the grounds together and then sit again. We'd have our different work assignments for that morning, sit again before lunch, have a short break after lunch, sit again before afternoon meditation. 3 times a week, we came together for group. And so that was a time when we'd break the silence to either engage in Dharma discussion and seeing what everyone was learning through their internal process,
Mhm.
learning from one another's practice, or having time with our teacher. And the community would generally, the outside community generally join us for that on Sunday. And we
Mhm.
had free time once a week on Sunday afternoon, holy leisure.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Great.
yeah.
I'd like to pivot to your most recent book, quick. And again, the title of that is Luminous Darkness, an Engaged Buddhist Approach to Embracing the Unknown. And as of this recording, this it's not out yet, but it'll probably be out by the time that goes up on the podcast networks. But so I kind of 5 major themes I kind of want to address real quick. But before we do that, can you spend just a moment talking about the overall thesis of the book, kind of like what the major theme is of the book as a whole?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. One invitation of the book is to really invite people to recognize that both on our personal spiritual path and as a collective right now, we are regularly facing the unknown. We're facing the field of darkness, the unseen, the invisible, that which we can't understand. and that there's great value in learning to turn towards the teacher of darkness, as luminous darkness, to learn how to meet the darkness from an open heart. And I give examples not just from Buddhism, but many different spiritual traditions who have deemed darkness, physical and symbolic, as a great, great teacher. And another point is to just invite people to recognize how interesting it is that we can carry these unconscious biases for generations and generations without totally examining and becoming free of them. And one of those is a bias that light is superior to dark, that yang is superior to yin, that fast is superior to slow, productivity is superior to being. I could go on and on. So I'm really inviting people into a path of learning to see from the heart, beyond unconscious biases and beyond the perception lens that splits into two and sees through binary perception. This is better and this is worse. And I would add that I talk in the book about a term that I had never heard before this project came to me, but to consider the value in giving ourselves to endarkenment alongside enlightenment, to just bring awareness to the fact that sometimes in our fixation with the light, which includes the rational mind and attainment and getting somewhere and getting to conclusion, and we want the light, we lose touch with the beauty and value of the deeper, darker undercurrents of our human experience. We begin to sense practice as a path to get somewhere, literally trying to attain enlightenment. And I won't say too much about endarkenment right now, but it's been quite beautiful to see how many people this has resonated with in terms of just opening up the possibility of more in their practice as people release some of the unconscious biases. Yeah?
Yeah. It's probably not terribly related to what you're talking about, but it made me think of, in Chinese Chan Buddhism, Chinese Zen Buddhism, they use the light and dark metaphor quite a bit, whereas light was subjective, relative, kind of regular day-to-day reality, whereas
Yes.
dark was emptiness and non-duality and absolute and ultimate reality. And
You've got it.
yeah,
That's it. And so often, even when people are newer to practice, they're afraid of emptiness. They think of emptiness as the absence of something.
mm,
And we think of darkness as the absence of light instead of what is it the presence of? What is the fertile darkness? What is the luminous darkness? And I'm really inviting people into an embodied exploration of this. I didn't write a dissertation on darkness. That would actually just be writing about light, offering a dissertation. But I offer a process, an exploratory process of inquiry and inviting people to expand their consciousness. Yeah.
so what do you mean by befriending the night? Like if you could you make like a concrete in some way, like maybe say like
Sure, sure. Well, I think I'll go back to one way that I talk about this in the book. That's a chapter in the book, and I share about in my early, maybe my first year, especially at the monastery. I mentioned that it was a solar community. So by the time the sun went down, 8 p.m., we were in pitch black. We were in darkness for the rest of the night. And there was at first a discomfort with the night, a recognition of my conditioned fear of night, even though night also represented something exciting, the fear of the unknown. And it's really touched the metaphor of my own internal journey of learning to befriend the night as an aspect of spiritual practice, meaning at that time for me, there was so much conditioning being revealed and being shed there was so much of the familiar, the identity I had been attached to or always seen myself as, being asked to let go and completely expand that. And it was terrifying to a part of me,
Hmm.
terrifying, but I also felt that same beckoning of possibility. So the attitude that I cultivated in that time and that practice invites us to was really learning to befriend the night, befriend these periods we're asked to go through, of really letting go of the known, the familiar, literally in practice, letting go of the familiar shore and not yet seeing where we will land, but
Hmm.
learning how to simply be fully present as we swim out into the waters of the unknown. And so much changed for me in that time. And it really allowed me, continually and later in life, when the things that happened, the things that life brought were not to my liking, were scary at first, were completely unknown, were unfamiliar, to meet it all in openness, with
Hmm.
respect, without judgment, with curiosity instead of fear. That's an important part of having a practice.
You talked about honoring our pain for our world. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Um, As a young person, I talked about being a student of environmental studies and no support being offered back then. I hope that there's a lot more now, for the internal process of opening one's eyes to what we've done and continue to do to the earth. I talked about having a mom who was a social justice activist. And so, again, my eyes being open from a young age to the injustices of our world, and for a long time not knowing what to do with that pain, with my heartbreak for the world, seeing people around me, some people just wanting to push it away, some to practice what I call sunshining, trying to keep it light, or that
Mhm.
avoidance, that spiritual bypass.
What
Other
they call
people,
is that like
yeah,
toxic positivity? I've heard people use that word before.
yeah, I think that's a good way to point to it. Toxic positivity, or even just a kind of energetic, resistance to, anything beneath the surface of lightness.
Mhm.
Resistance to discomfort, which is a natural part of being human and a natural part of growth. But for me, the more I, deepened my meditation practice, there was such a recognition of an all welcoming field that did not, uh, value pleasant experiences over unpleasant, that didn't, in that field, push away, pain or grief, that was able to hold it all in vastness, in spacious acceptance. And it was transformative for me to honor my pain for the world in that way. And
Mhm.
then alongside it, to recognize that this is actually the path that allowed me to transform my pain for the world and my love for the world into compassionate action, into conscious response, into actually a daily moment by moment inquiry into how to be of service. And when I say inquiry, of course, inquiry is never a heady conversation, it's an embodied, emergent practice of inquiry and being
Mhm.
guided. And so that's been a part of my life. I'll give a shout out for Joanna Macy once more, because she guides and founded a field of work called The Work That Reconnects, which I also facilitate today, which is a way of bringing groups of people through a process of honoring our pain and love for our world and transforming it into compassionate action. And more as what we're facing becomes more accelerated, there's a real need for this, and a real need to remember that, together, that we can support one another and access our true nature even more potently when we're willing to metabolize our grief. And it's not just our grief, it's our ancestors' grief. It's the grief from endless past generations. It's the grief we might feel for a form of life we didn't even know we were one with. It's part of being human, that we're part of the natural feedback system of planet Earth. So I hope that describes some of what I mean by it.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And so this next one, I think you kind of hinted at it a couple times, but wonder if you talk about it a little more explicitly. The phrase you have is seeing in the dark, the quiet power of receptivity. Receptivity.
Yeah. You know, I feel tender hearing you name that phrase, which is a phrase I use often, but it's something that is so meaningful for me. So first, let's acknowledge that in the domain of light, this is akin to the mind of discrimination, what I call the mind of separation, that conditioned tendency to always be labeling, judging, and categorizing life. That's part of our egoic need to know, to get to conclusions, and that we're comfortable just with what we can see and understand. Makes sense so far?
Yeah, definitely.
And I use a metaphor in the book for these times we're in and the spiritual path, that it's like finding oneself in a dark, thicketed forest where there are no brightly lit pathways or signs pointing the way. And in the dark, even when we close our eyes, let's say for meditation, there's an awakening that occurs with our other senses, an awakening that occurs dropping into more relational forms of knowing, a deeper center of intelligence than just the rational mind. And this has been a profound part of my life's journey. I think because, you know, I mentioned that as a young person, I always was a sensitive person. I always had a very receptive way of being. And yet I was conditioned to discount that, to not see that as a great strength. You know, yang is strength, force is strength, loudness is strength, right? But receptivity is not something we think of as strength. I today consider receptivity our greatest source of strength. And we access this receptivity through meditation. And there's a learning, a remembering how to see in the dark, how to see with a center of intelligence that is much deeper than the mind of discrimination and labeling.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, so the kind of the last major theme I'd like to touch on here, I really like this phrase, releasing fear, embracing emergence. Could you describe what you mean by emergence in this context?
Sure, yeah. Something I've always loved about meditation is the way that it expands our relationship to time, so
Mm-hmm.
that the notion of linear time as the only way, or
Mm-hmm.
linear time as truth or God, naturally begins to dissolve. And there's a sense, as it's referred to in Buddhism, of deep time or being time. There's
Mm-hmm.
a teaching
So good.
called,
Yeah.
yes, Uji from Dogen.
Yeah.
And one way for listeners to connect with this is just that experience of when we're resting in awareness, not caught in or tangled in what's arising in our experience, but resting in the awareness from which it's arising. We are aware of all of life as emergent, and we're aware of the process of emergence as a constant. So there's all that's arising and passing, that's ever changing, and then there's awareness itself, which is not changing. And resting in emergence, in my experience, creates a much more vibrantly alive and also accepting understanding of the processes of life. And in the book, I invite people to consider the teaching of emergence as we navigate climate change. You know,
Mhm.
it's so easy to get kind of in a loop in our heads around it. We can hardly digest or fathom the gravity of it. It's a hard thing for people to digest. But I'm thinking about emergence in the bigger picture, that alongside the compassionate actions we do need to take and strategize for in this time of change, we can also acknowledge that nature exists in and as emergence, that the earth has been in a process of emergence since before the beginning of beginningless time, as we talk about in Buddhism. And rather than being stuck in the sort of binary perception of beginnings and endings, or uh, something being in the creation state versus dissolving, that life is always in a state of emergence. Yeah,
Mhm. Yeah, I kind of like the idea of emergence because it kind of seems to kind of transcend cause and effect. You know, it's kind of a non-causal
you got it. You
flow.
got
You
it.
know, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and it points more to dependent co-arising, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so kind of to wrap up here, I wanted to talk a little bit about more about your community. So so is it mostly group activity, or do you work one-on-one with people?
I do work one-on-one with people, and historically, I've also worked with couples,
Hmm.
um, as well as with organizations.
Hmm.
Uh, though right now, I think there's a waiting list for all of that. But one of my favorite ways to work with people is for people to be part of both a group process that I guide and to do some individual work with me to
Hmm.
really help people navigate what's being revealed to them in their
Hmm.
practice,
Hmm.
and to uh, become freer of what it's time to let go of. So there's many ways that I work with people, but the group experience, my second book was relational mindfulness, and
Hmm.
I will name humbly that one of my skills is helping people to drop into shared presence and to recognize that we wake up together, not
Hmm.
in isolation. And so the beauty, it's so healing for people to come to a group experience, a community experience together, especially when there's a lot of us have been conditioned. We can't trust group fields. We have to have a guard up, even subtly,
Yeah.
um, that kind of thing. To let that dissolve and to be guided into a different possibility. I'll just add that in many, many different wisdom traditions, shamanism, which you've mentioned, included, healing occurs in community, witnessed by community, doesn't occur in isolation.
Sure.
And I'm a firm advocate for this. Yeah.
Mhm. What so are most people you work with, do they have a daily meditation practice, or do you kind of work with people kind of at a kind of a counseling level? Like do you pretty much just want to deal with meditators, or kind of what is the I'm not articulating this as well as I hope, but do you get the gist of what I'm asking?
I do, yeah. First, I would add that over time, I've worked with all kinds of different people and all kinds of populations.
Mhm.
And I mean, really vast and diverse. And right now, the focus of my work seems to be both a meditation community that invites people from all different levels of experience
Mhm.
to come and receive the medicine that is theirs to receive through meditation. So both beginners and people who've been practicing for decades are part of our community. And also, I work a lot with uh, leaders and activists and people who consider themselves agents of change, facilitators, people who are guiding groups themselves. So I have a couple of programs that are specifically geared towards that, because there's so much need in our world today. And then I also have certain offerings that I held monthly, which are just for women,
Mhm.
teaching around the deep feminine and the need for restoring deep feminine leadership in our world. And lastly, I would just say that one of the things I love about being a teacher is the creative component of it. So I hold all kinds of different retreats, from eco-dharma to relational mindfulness, now to luminous darkness. And I think most people could come to my website and find something that invites them in. Yeah.
Yeah, great.
Mm-hmm.
While you're just talking about eco-dharma, it popped in my mind. Have you ever known about or even worked with David Loy? I think he's out of Colorado.
Yes.
He does a lot of eco-dharma stuff too.
Yes, I met David Loy when we were both speaking at an international Dharma teachers gathering some years back in New York on climate change. And he has a fabulous eco-dharma center in the Rockies, which I've led retreat at. And I'm currently part of an eco-dharma committee that David Loy is part of too. That's a group of Buddhist teachers forming community together to look at how can we, through eco-dharma, be of greater service in this age of climate change. So we'll see what emerges from that group. He's great. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned couples work. I'm curious. You mentioned you lived with your husband in North Carolina. Is he a practitioner? Is he involved in the community, or is he a teacher, or
He's a practitioner, and he's a healer. He actually makes flower essences. So he has a deep embodiment of connection to the earth through the world of plants. It's just kind of a gift he's been given. But I will share with laughter that, I think when I first left the monastery and was kind of re-entering the realm of dating and romance, I think there was some very limited romantic notion of like, oh, maybe I'll meet another Zen teacher, which by the way makes your options really, really, really slim. Right. And I remember one of the first people I dated in that time was a kind of quite beloved yoga teacher, and I remember noticing that as cool as he was carrying a whole lot of ego, and I just laughed at myself, like having this assumption that if someone's in the teacher role, they were freer from that. Yeah. And I love recognizing the Dharma in as many places, shapes, and forms as we can. And while Zen Buddhism is my home, I've been informed by so many different wisdom streams and practices. And so the cross-pollination of it is really important. Yeah. And I might just offer the relational mindfulness book I wrote, and the reason I started working with couples and then also organizations was just seeing that meditation offers us such a bridge to relational intelligence, to a way of being and showing up that really allows us to have genuine, meaningful, and healing relationships. And I shared that I lost my dad quite young. So the notion of the importance of relationships and how we show up to them, I was never blind to. But after I left the monastery, I just kind of recognized, living in the noisy field, in the social field of LA again, that a bigger bridge was needed for folks. And so that's when I wrote that book and did a whole lot of teaching on certain principles that help us to show up to the beautiful and dynamic and messy field of relationships in a really good way. Yeah.
Last question here. So when you have newbies or beginners come to your group, what kind of meditation practices do you have them do kind of to get going?
Sure. I guide Zen meditation. I guide earth-based meditations that really help people to get down into their bodies, which is from where we awaken. I also guide open awareness practices, and I always guide relational mindfulness practices. So we'll spend some time just in personal meditation and some time in guided practices for deep listening to one another, or for witnessing one another, because it's just invaluable for folks to recognize that meditation doesn't just happen on the cushion. It can happen in every one of our connections.
And do you have everyone try all of them, or do you kind of mix and match based on their kind of the causes and conditions of their life situations?
I'm always guided in the moment, and I'm guided by emergence. So there is not a 5-step prescription. I teach through intuition of what people need. And I'll also share that I teach through other tools as well. There are groups I guide where I offer both sitting meditation and conscious movement dance as a teacher in awakening.
Mm-hmm.
There are groups where we're doing a lot of meditating in nature in specific ways. It really varies. Again, I teach with a very creative template.
Great.
Yeah.
So if someone wanted to get in touch with you and kind of explore working with you, what's the best way for them to contact you?
I think the best way would be first to visit my website, which is deborahedentall.com, and to consider coming out to a Tuesday meditation, and that's offered every Tuesday from 9 to 10 Pacific time, or to sign up for a Luminous Darkness monthly offering if you're excited by the teachings in that book, and also to check out if there are any particular retreats or workshops that the theme of which are calling you. It's been phenomenal from my perspective to see how deep we can go even through Zoom gatherings during these past couple of years. And I love the in-person as well. But, you know, presence allows us to show up to any situation, including a Zoom session, deeply attuned to the energetic field. And it's beautiful that we have that access.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so appreciative of your time. Thank you so much.
Say that again?
I'm just very appreciative of your time. Thank you so much.
Well, I've really enjoyed your questions. Thanks so much.
Yeah,
So
my pleasure.
thank you for having me on today.
Have a wonderful day and good luck on your book.
Thank you. Be
Okay.
well.
Thank you. You too.